Our future economy will be much more decentralized. A lot of us have heard stories about what this future might look like, right, in the news. Stories about robots that'll have wallets, or drones that are going to do last-mile delivery, or even AIs that actually negotiate with each other in their own language because it's more efficient. Or one I heard after South by Southwest, which is we can now 3D print sushi. So these stories, they're kind of amazing, right? They make us think about all of the things that are going to change in our world and in our economy. But what they fail to do is help us actually understand what's happening underneath. What are some of the changes that technologies are bringing about in our actual economic infrastructure, and how do we start to think about what those changes mean holistically? So today I'm going to talk a bit about blockchain technology in particular, but I really want to ground it in some principles that you should keep in mind as you start to either experiment with or learn about some of these technologies. And I like this quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson: "The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble." So rather than just sort of testing because there's a new technology, thinking about where that technology fits and the principles associated with it is very important. So if we think about sort of our economic history, we can go way back in time. We can think to our early agrarian days, and our exchanges of value were quite different. We were able to exchange value much more directly, one-to-one. We had a lot more control over our interactions because our societies were much smaller. And that gave us a lot more certainty in those transactions. But over time, our distance and even the complexity in our trade routes grew. And we didn't have that one-to-one kind of relationship anymore. We didn't know the party that we were interacting with at the end. And so to deal with this sort of rising uncertainty in our trade and transactions, we invented institutions. Institutions like banks, mercantile associations, marketplaces, really just rules and protocols that help drive lowered uncertainty and allowed us to do business with each other at greater and greater scale. Eventually, if we fast forward even further, we put these same institutions online. We built platform marketplaces like eBay, Amazon, Alibaba. Really just still these institutions, middlemen, that help us transact with lowered uncertainty at greater scale. And this is what we're extending upon now that we have blockchain technology. But the main difference here is that blockchain allows us to have a technological way to lower uncertainty and still increase the scale and scope of our business interactions, instead of relying on institutions. So what's interesting is this actually looks a lot more like that early part, the trade, the one-to-one trade from our agrarian days, where we have much more direct knowledge and transparency in our interactions, but we're doing this at a greater scale. So this is the principle I want you to kind of hold on to in thinking about this technology. It's really just a continuation of a story in which we continuously lower uncertainty in order to expand our ability to trade as people. It's something we've always done. Now, blockchain itself is a buzzword. We hear it a lot now at conferences and in the news, but it's very unvisual, right? It's kind of hard to grasp what that really means as a technology. So I like to use the analogy of a physical checkbook. If you go to write a check, what you're really doing is writing the terms of a deal. I'm going to pay you X dollars, and then I sign it, authenticating it, and then your bank and my bank perform this transaction using the address, the routing numbers, all of the details associated with the terms of this deal. Now, if you completed all of the checks in a given checkbook, you'd end up with that kind of stack of carbon copies of all of the transactions you've made over the period of time you had the checkbook. That's basically what a block of data is in a blockchain. It's a set of transactions that have happened over a period of time that are lumped together, in this case cryptographically, and linked to a set of previous transactions, forming a chain. Now, what's different is from the checkbook example, where our banks are sort of negotiating with each other and checking each other's ledgers to make sure that the right amount moves across our accounts to perform that transaction. We're using basically software run on a group of networked computers, a peer-to-peer network that holds the same database. And we're using that group to come to agreement on the transactions that have happened and execute them. So this is one of the main sort of differences in blockchains, is we're looking at systems that have no central administrator and are able to record transactions over time. Now, if we think about the way that our internet evolved, when we have our sort of public internet, right? We can all read and write to. But when the internet first came about, we also had all of these intranets, sort of company-scoped versions of this technology that allowed for new communication patterns. And we're sort of seeing the same thing happen, broadly speaking, in the blockchain space. We have public blockchain networks like the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum network, but we also have private versions of blockchains, ways that people are starting to experiment at the company level or at the industry level or for a special purpose, potentially for government services, and they're scoping those blockchains in different ways. So it's sort of similar to intranets in that same kind of context. We're able to control the governance and some of the mechanisms involved. If we think back to the evolution of blockchain, it's rather new, right? We saw the Bitcoin white paper emerge in 2008, describing Bitcoin and essentially the underlying architecture of a blockchain. And since then, we've seen a lot of growth. We've had the Ethereum network emerge, which really took this idea of sort of financial transactions in a digital framework and pushed it out to be sort of broader, more generalized, that we can do programmable transactions. And we're seeing this get pushed even further. In just a short amount of time, we've seen the emergence of lots of different kinds of blockchains. Blockchains that optimize for different features. Maybe it's privacy, like Zcash, or Definity, which is actually pushing forward for a blockchain that doesn't really revolve around crypto economics. So we're seeing lots of different advances in this protocol layer that's actually pushing us towards what we think of as an internet of blockchains, a time where we might actually have many special purpose kinds of blockchains, blockchains that are run in a certain way or scoped in a certain way, but interconnect, are interoperable, and transactions on one can feed into other networks. So this is some of the future where we're headed. Now, the principle I want you to keep in mind here is actually this sort of bigger idea that blockchains are really modern-day, decentralized virtual computers. So that sort of story about we have this network of computers, a peer-to-peer construct that's running the same software, you can think of it as many unreliable computers functioning as one reliable computer. Now, this technology stack for a blockchain is actually not that dissimilar to what we use today in our digital age. We have core infrastructure. So those are the core protocols that define the Bitcoin network or the Ethereum network. For the internet, those are things like TCP/IP, SMTP, HTTP, that help define the communications infrastructure and architecture. Above it, we have middleware. Those for blockchains are usually clients that allow you to write to the core protocols. And in our modern day world, those are APIs and libraries that we use to write to our core protocols. And then above it, we have applications. Our day-to-day use is email, Uber, all the apps you might find on your smartphone. In the blockchain space, this is slightly different. The application space, we're seeing many prototypes and people trying to sort of suss out use cases for essentially decentralized software, which looks quite different. Part of the reason it looks different is the idea of a smart contract. If you go back to that checkbook analogy, what we described as the terms of a deal, you can write the terms of a deal in computer-readable code. You can take, essentially, a contract, which a check kind of represents, it's an IOU, and transcribe it into basically software that will get executed across a decentralized computer system. So what's innovative in terms of smart contracts and their use in blockchain applications is really this idea that we can automate business logic. And on top of that, we can automate governance, right? So conditions and terms that we can set out as rules can be executed by computers. Now, all of this might actually still sound pretty far into the future. And so I want to go one level deeper. And that is something you all probably have a lot more familiarity with, which is the level of supply chains. If we think about global trade, and we can say this economic story is continuing, we now have a new technology that allows us to lower our uncertainty in a new way, instead of using institutions. That's an amazing thing, but it's not just amazing for sort of this transaction layer of global trade. It means we actually need to think about the things we are trading and how decentralization will affect those. So all of the products that we design, make, and deliver through supply chains are also going to face some of these same decentralizing sort of changes. So at Animal Ventures, our firm, we believe we're really entering a golden age of supply chain innovation. And it's not just because of blockchain. We're seeing other technologies, emerging technologies like AI and the Internet of Things and additive manufacturing really come together in new and interesting ways. But supply chains are part of this story of trade that's going to change the most. And it's an area where we can prototype and think about those changes in unique ways. We actually, I'll just go back a second, we have a white paper coming out on the future of supply chain called Asset Chains, it was part of the Blockchain Research Institute initiative that Don Tapscott led, and that will be coming out this week. So you guys should definitely look into that and think a little more about supply chain innovation. But don't get me wrong, supply chains today are already getting smarter, right? We have predictive analytics. We have tools for different kinds of intelligence at the top. We're able to look into these systems and understand and learn many more things than we used to be able to by using smart algorithms. And below it, we have a lot more data, right? We're gathering data now from sensors, from smart machines, from 3D printers, from all of these new sort of additive manufacturing and automative technologies that are entering how we manufacture and produce our products and even deliver. So we have a lot more real-time information. But we don't really have this bottom layer, this idea of network state, a shared reality for these upper two to transact upon. And that's a lot of what we think blockchain plays into. So our supply chains have been getting smarter, have been getting more data, but in these silos of enterprises. And we haven't had a means of transacting across all of that information in a way that creates one shared reality. What this does is it goes a lot further than we might think. When we open up the ability to have this shared reality, and we have a global decentralized computer that we can run different kinds of executions on top of, we're basically capable of opening up what we like to call machine trust. It's an extension of that economic story I told at the beginning. If we're able to lower our uncertainty and trade in new ways, that's not just for humans. We're literally inventing an infrastructure upon which we can write rules for machines and execute them across these shared protocols. So this brings me back to that idea of robots that have wallets, or last mile drone delivery, or 3D printed sushi, or all of these changes we're starting to see, in that we actually need to create a way for those objects, those AIs even, to be able to transact with one another, not relying on humans, but relying on rules. So people often ask us at Animal Ventures, how are we going to sort of thrive in this future? What does a decentralized economy mean for people? And I like to point to this image that was drawn by Paul Barron in 1964. It was a paper he wrote on distributed communications. And he was working at really thinking about how our communication infrastructure should change in the face of the Cold War. It was a very centralized system, and it was a threat. And so he wanted to find a way to architect this system that would be more resilient. And so he designed what basically became part of our modern day internet. He invented packet switching, part of the way that we route information across nodes. And when he drew this, he basically meant that the next thing that was inevitable was an internet. Not necessarily the exact internet that we have, but a global communications infrastructure that anybody can use. So I like to look back at this because part of what we need to start thinking about are what are the inevitabilities based on some of the new technologies we're seeing, like blockchain. They're similarly decentralizing technologies, and they will create their own sort of inevitable outcomes, things that are going to happen, maybe not in particular form, but in their sort of purpose. We're going to see a lot of innovation that takes advantage of these technologies. And to us, it means we need to start thinking about how humans, machines, and organizational forms start working together in order to drive value creation. And that's going to look quite different than we're used to. The trade-offs are different, the responsibilities are different. We have to sort of rethink a lot of these systems that we're used to seeing a certain way. So we actually all need to become a little bit more like Leonardo da Vinci. He was the epitome of artist meets scientist. He was a creative and able to sort of ideate, come up with brilliant new schemes for things. This was a drawing of his flying machine. And yet he also was a scientist. He was able to prototype, experiment, learn, iterate. And a lot of what we're going to have to do together is actually start to use technologies to prototype faster and become more of the design inputs into these systems so that we can simulate our supply chains, we can learn, we can invent, and actually test them in new ways. So a lot of what I want to leave you with is that as a goal. You should be experimenting in this space because you will learn a lot more about how your relationship as a business will change with all of the machinery and the intelligence and now the decentralized infrastructure that we're going to see change our economy. Thank you so much. I want to invite Chris Kirchner actually back up, and we thought we would just chat through some of the things we're seeing today and interested in today in the blockchain space and sort of have a couple minutes of a chat. So, you're very far away, Chris.
They told me to move these closer together.
I'll move this way.
I mean, we're friends now, so I'm allowed to do that, right? So, we had a really interesting conversation. I wish they would have videotaped it backstage. There are a lot of polarizing views in blockchain and cryptocurrency, and are they the same thing? Are they different? How are they the same, or how are they different? But I'd like you, why don't you share with the crowd kind of some of your thoughts on exactly that question. What is the difference between blockchain and cryptocurrency and the differing impacts of the two?
Yeah, it's an important question, I think. At Animal Ventures, we really strongly pursue that principle around thinking of these as global decentralized computers that anyone can read to and write to. I mean, that's an incredible thought, really. And if you isolate it, if you just pay attention to that, you're not thinking about currencies, right? That's not really part of that story. You're thinking about what are going to be the applications that I can build on top of this thing that are going to execute, regardless? What does that mean, even? What does that mean for business? So I think it's an incredibly important distinction at this time, because as much as there's lots of activity in the ICO world and fundraising and trading of cryptocurrencies, what we're seeing for enterprise is the interest in how do I leverage decentralized technology for new kinds of innovation in supply chain in particular. So, I mean, for this group, I would say, start thinking about what is a supply chain computer, right? Or a trucking computer. What could that mean?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. I'm sure some of the people out in the room here have had that. So I guess let's dive into the enterprise a little further now. What do you think the challenges are, or the barriers to adoption of blockchain in the enterprise space, in the supply chain, in the transportation industry? What are the headwinds or challenges ahead?
So I actually am I'm not a technologist. I'm sort of a governance nerd.
We have that in common.
We do have that in common. I came into the blockchain space mostly from a governance perspective, thinking about it as, how is this kind of technology going to reshape a lot of our traditional relationships that help us do business or, govern or do any number of things. And I think what's very interesting on the adoption side is we actually are seeing the hardest part is not the technology. It's how do you think about business differently? How do you sort of change your mindset and think about, co-opetition? What does it mean, if you have a network capability, you want to grow the network, right? That's actually a good thing. So what does it mean to work alongside potentially a competitor? And how do you sort of change people's mindset around the role of the firm or the role of their brand, and how they can still have a shared reality and shared technology infrastructure that they can leverage together? So I think it's an interesting time to sort of question some of our traditional beliefs about what the firm is supposed to do and what some of the old trade-offs were, and maybe the new opportunities are to sort of get rid of some of that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, because I think what you guys are doing in the enterprise space is also interesting.
Yeah, I love it. It's a fun challenge. We were talking earlier about being problem solvers, and it's a business model or mindset problem, right, or challenge. And what we found, I know, in our engagements with customers and interactions with some of our co-innovation partners, the mindset is actually there to a certain extent already. People are more open to it and realizing that by working together, positive things happen for all of the companies in the network. It's not an either or thing. It's everybody can do it together. It's an and equation. So it's been a pleasant surprise for us as we've engaged customers and have started doing things, not talking about blockchain, but actually doing things that are blockchain based with our, in our case, our platform, the Slink platform. A little self-promotion there. But
that's a big deal too, is even, it's very hard to describe blockchain because it is so non-visual to people, and putting a product in somebody's hands, being able to use the technology, within your own business, even if it's not productionized, not part of your, live systems, gives a totally new perspective, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. For us, having a completed product, something tangible that people can see and say, okay, I understand how this connects to my business, how this delivers a return on the investment that I'm making, how we get better as a group because of it. I think that's the next wave or where the industry needs to go to be successful. And I'm a little biased in saying that because that's the approach we've taken. But, in talking about making things tangible, you guys do prototyping, which I find fascinating. So what's a cool project that you'd like to share with the people out here that you've done, or something interesting that has solved a particular problem or created some value for a customer of yours?
I mean, prototyping for us is sort of a unique experience where you're not starting from the technology, you're starting from a business problem, right? What is your business problem. And that's what shapes a use case. And so for us, our process is really to scope a business problem in a way that we can say, here's a hypothesis. Here's something we can actually test against, and a KPI we want to measure to see how we're doing. And then we'll go build, over the course of 3 months. It's a really short period of time to put a product out. It's not going to be productionized in 3 months, right? But it's getting you to a place where you have something in your hands that you can understand how it fits your system, and does it solve a problem you believe you have. So I mean, it's such an interesting process, and we're seeing use cases that sort of abound. Supply chain is a history of transactions for a product from its beginning all the way to you or an end customer, and it involves all of those things from designing the product to making the product to actually delivering it and getting it somewhere. So I'm starting to see a lot in, obviously, track and trace, serialization, things like test upon import. How do you move product across borders and think about that in a unique way if you can automate business logic and automate governance? And then you could give even a government a view into that reality that you share, right? And I think that's something I find interesting, is people have always these opinions that somehow this is not for government, or it's there's the crypto anarchists, and there's absolutely a role for that kind of sort of philosophy in this space, but there's also a role for saying we can actually do compliance innovation. Yeah. We can let, instead of having governments that audit all of these things and do it not necessarily very well, we can drive safety and auditing into a process and give that view in real time.
Yeah, and so the auditing thing's interesting. We hear that a lot from customers as a problem or an issue, and so it's interesting you brought that up. But on the time thing, timing is something that I think people, maybe cryptocurrency has driven, I guess, unrealistic expectations in terms of how fast blockchain will become relevant, right? Or how fast it'll be widely adopted. What do you see in terms of timeline? Like, when can we expect everybody using blockchain, right? When is blockchain the only way that companies interact or transact with each other?
In Silicon Valley, there's a famous quote attributed to Roy Amara, who was sort of a futurist, and it's called Amaras Law. And he said, we tend to overestimate technology's importance in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. And I think that's true. That's human nature. We're kind of built that way, right? So we get excited and we think this thing is going to change the world tomorrow, right? And it's not. This is a 10-year time horizon, and it's going to take a while for not only the use cases to be experimented and tested and learned from, but then that whole world of productionizing something, making sure it plugs into your legacy architecture, making sure you're okay on the regulatory side. All of those issues and constraints will have to be solved for. So I think there's the Roy Amara version of blockchain, which is keep excited about it, but think about that 10-year horizon. Like, where do you want to be in 10 years as a business? And then I'd say there's another quip, which is from John Scully, which says technology should either be beautiful or invisible. And so to me, blockchain is like, you probably won't know you're using a blockchain, right? The interfaces we design today, they're your regular old interfaces. They're the things you would use, as an app. So I think hopefully we get to that place where there's understanding of it, but maybe also just it's in the background. It's not something that every person is going to have to, understand how to run a full node and be a miner, and that's a little bit too foreign, I think, to expect that.
Yeah, completely agree. Anything else that comes top of mind that you want to share based on kind of my questions, or anything you want to ask in return? I'll let you.
Yeah, I think I would love to hear just more about where you think this kind of group should be putting their energy and thinking about supply chain innovation, and also sort of, is it going to be customers who drive the changes, or where are we going to see the changes coming from?
Yeah. Yeah, I wish I had a clever quote for this. I'm sorry, I don't. I need something off the cuff, but I liked your quotes, and I like the sentiment of a lot of it. I think it's you know, maybe I'm a pragmatist in this, but I think it's setting realistic goals. You know, on a 10-year horizon, thinking, okay, where do I need to be in 2? Where do I need to be in 5? Where do I need to be in 7 to get to that 10-year, that benchmark? And setting realistic expectations and realistic projects that lead down that road. You know, I was having this conversation actually with one of our partners at UPS, and he and I, you know, kind of got deep in the weeds one day, and you know, one of the things we talked about is everyone needs to think of this as a crawl, walk, run, right? You aren't born at a dead sprint, and so you have to start somewhere and build. And I think some of the marketing about blockchain paints this big boil the ocean, everything has to be done immediately solution, all or nothing. And I think that's a little misleading or just flat out not true. It needs to be, let's start with something that we can accomplish. 3 companies, 4 companies in a smaller network that all have something to gain by collaborating, and then build. And that's the approach that we've taken, and it's sometimes baffling to me why we're one of the few companies looking at it that way. You know, we talked about this a little earlier, but I think the more that that's embraced of let's get some of our close trading partners or people that we can benefit together in a small, you know, achievable way and build from there. And that's how you hit that 10-year benchmark of, okay, wow, look at all this stuff we've accomplished in the last decade, and look at how much better not only, you know, your individual businesses, but the business of your partners. And in a supply chain where it's so interconnected, you know, a high tide raises all ships. And so everyone, by working together, will get better together, which at the end of the day benefits everyone's customer or your shared customer.
Yeah. I mean, I think we wrote a little bit about it in our in the white paper we have coming out, but thinking about sort of, you know, what are some of the new skills for this world, and then what are some of the trade-offs you might be able to let go of, right?
Yeah.
There are things that you used to calculate that you might not need to calculate that anymore, and you know, like the trade-off between efficiency and responsiveness in a supply chain or things like that. You're like, well, that might not play. I might have both efficiency and I can be really responsive in new ways. So I think there's, you know, what is this future of like networked organizations going to look like is an open question.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one too. It's fun to think in, you know, in kind of the Wild West that is blockchain right now. It's incredible to think about what the world could be, and now taking more pragmatic steps of how do we get there.
What are the dominoes?
Yeah. What are the dominoes that need to fall to make that happen?
Yeah.
I know we're almost out of time. That clock is really big. But thanks everybody for having us.
Yeah,
unless you have anything else to add.
Yeah,
thank you.
For a great
and on a personal note, thank you for voting for Slink. We really appreciate your support, appreciate the excitement and things that you've shared with us. It's fun to be around people who are excited about this change that Bettina and I are both championing and trying to push forward. So thank you everybody, and see you guys out in the hall.
Thanks.